Job thinks that God has picked him up and set him up as his target and is pouring arrows into him. And yet Job still calls on God to be his witness. Let's open up the Bible and think on these things. This is the Word of Truth Ministry video library. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's turn to Job chapter 16, where we have just seen Eliphaz the Temanite make his second great accusation against Job, and insist that Job is wicked. That it's Job's own wicked actions that have led to all the calamity that has come upon him. And yet Job chapter 16 and verse 1, then Job answered and said. So Job makes his second reply to Eliphaz. Then verse 2, and I'm going to be reading again in Bullinger's poetic translation. Job 16, verse 2, of such like things I have abundance heard. Yea, ministers of trouble are ye all. So Job says, I've heard plenty of such arguments. And he says, what good do they do? I've heard such arguments over and over that, bad things only happen to bad people. So he says, you are supposed to be ministers. You're supposed to be helping me in my trouble, and yet you're just wearisome. You just wear me out. You just tire me out. You don't help at all. Verse 3, shall such vain words come never to an end? Or what emboldens thee to answer still? So he calls their arguments ruach, is the Hebrew word, the word for spirit. These are spirit words. In other words, windy words. They're just windy words. And he is using Eliphaz terminology. He says it's your words that are the ruach, the windy ones. He says, and what emboldens thee to answer still? He says, wasn't your first argument enough? Didn't I show you up thoroughly enough the first time? Why do you have to answer again? Why do you have to argue again? Verse 4, for I could also speak as well as ye, if ye were in distress instead of me. Against you I could heap together words. Against you I could shake my head in scorn. So Job points out, I could act just like you do. If I was in your shoes. If it was your soul that was in all this trouble instead of my soul. I could heap up words against you. I could shake my head in scorn at you. I could act righteous and pure by pouring angry words on the heads of a miserable wretch like you are. I could do the same thing. If you were in this situation of distress, I could treat you the same way. Verse 5, I with my mouth could also harden you, and with my lips I too could you restrain. So he says, I could also harden you with my mouth. I could restrain you with my lips. I could treat you like you treat me. Or I could strengthen you. I could restrain your misery by the things I say. Verse 6, though if I speak, my grief is not assuaged. If I forbear, how much of it departs? Remember, Eliphaz had blamed him for speaking. He says, you shouldn't say such things, Job. He says, well, is my grief lessened? When I speak, my grief isn't assuaged. My grief isn't lessened. So he says, if I don't speak then, how much of my grief would depart? If I kept quiet like you told me to do? Would that fix anything? Would that help anything? Would that really do anything, Eliphaz? Verse 7, God hath verily exhausted me. yea, all my family thou hast destroyed. So he says, God has exhausted me. God has worn me out. And he says that God has destroyed the Hebrew word is edah, his congregation. God has destroyed my congregation, my gathering. And by this he probably means, as Bullinger translates it, his family. All those who gathered around him, his whole household. Now notice once again that Job is making the same assumption that his friends were making, which was that God is the one doing this to him. All that has happened to him has been God's doing. And neither Job nor his friends has any concept that it might be Satan doing this to him. Now when he says, my congregation you have destroyed, remember that his children all died when a house fell on them. And what about his wife? She's still alive. Well, she told him to curse God and die. So she might still be alive, but her life isn't going to really help Job. She is just told him, go ahead and die, Job. Give up. Well, not help she is. Verse 8, and shriveled up my skin. Look what a sight. My leanness like a witness riseth up, and testifies my ruin to my face. So Job says, besides destroying my family, he shriveled my skin. And we'd have to admit that at this point, Job, with all his illness, and he's probably so upset he can't eat if he even could find food, so he's become emaciated, and he probably was pretty hideous looking at this point. Now Eliphaz had spoken of fatness for prosperity. And so now Job uses the opposite figure, and he speaks of his leanness. It's showing his ruin, his poverty, his trouble. His leanness just shows the state he's in. So his leanness is the witness that rises up and testifies of his ruin to his face. You can't deny how lean he is, how emaciated he is, that it just shows his ruin. He never would have been lean, emaciated before. Verse 9, his anger rends and maketh war on me, and he hath gnashed upon me with his teeth. He is mine enemy. His eyes are swords. So he describes his tormentor. Now we know from having read the first couple of chapters of Job that his tormentor is really Satan. That Satan is the one doing all this to him. But that's not what Job believes. Job believes when he describes his tormentor that he's describing God. Now he says that God is tearing me. God is making war on me. He's gnashed on me with his teeth. So either it's like so angry at him. It also could mean like he's chewed me up with his teeth. Gnashed on me. He says, God is my enemy. His eyes are swords attacking me. Verse 10, and vile men gape upon me with their mouths, and with contempt they smite me on my cheeks, and band themselves against me all at once. So it's clear Job isn't just meekly taking the criticism of his friends, who are calling him all these things and saying how bad he is. No, Job is coming back at them. He's talking about them gaping on him with their mouths. Of course, their mouths open, pouring out all these arguments and accusations against him. Now, of course, they didn't literally strike him on the cheek, but their words did. Their words and their contempt struck him over and over and over again, and they might as well have been striking him on the cheek. And he says, they're band together against me all at once. They're ganged up on me. Verse 11, God to the evil one delivers me, and headlong cast me into hands malign. So he says, God, the mighty God, has delivered me to the evil one. Now, could it be that Job actually references Satan here? If he did, of course, he'd be actually hitting close to the truth. Finally, and that it is Satan who has caused all this to happen to Job. You can't help but think that more than likely, Job is thinking of Eliphaz as the enemy, as the evil one to whom God has delivered him, and cast him headlong into malign hands that are only interested in hurting him. Verse 12, at ease I was when he did shatter me. He seized my neck and dashed me to the ground. He picked me up and set me for his mark. So he describes his sudden ruin like he's sitting there at ease, Everything's good. Everything's comfortable. And all of a sudden, God grabs him by the neck and picks him up and dashes him to the ground. And then as he's lying on there on the ground, what happened? God picks him up again and sets him up and says to his archers, okay, there's your target. He's made him his mark. That means his target. Verse 13, his archers did encompass me around. One cleaves my reins asunder, spares me not. Another pours my gall upon the earth. So he describes God's archers surrounding him. And one is hitting him with arrows, cleaving his reins asunder. He doesn't spare me. Another one causes his gall to pour out on the earth. They're splitting him open with their arrows, driving into his chest. That's how he's describing it. And his gall pours out on the earth. That's the Hebrew eretz, which means on the land. Verse 14, another breaketh me with breach on breach. He runneth at me like a man of war. So he says, another breaketh me with breach on breach. And those words break and breach are two related words, verb and noun. One breaks me with break on break, or breaches me with breach on breach. And describing again, hitting him with arrow after arrow after arrow. And then he runneth at me like a man of war. Now the Old King James Version has, he runneth upon me like a giant. This isn't the word for giant. The Hebrew is Gabor. And Gabor is a mighty man of war. A powerful soldier, ready to fight powerfully in the army as a soldier. So God runs on him like a man of war, running on him to destroy him. Verse 15, I have sown sackcloth round about myself. My glory is defiled in the dust. So he describes how he has sown sackcloth on himself. And sackcloth was this thin, cheap cloth that normally no one would wear. But traditionally in their culture, it was the clothes of mourning. You take this cheap, thin sackcloth and you'd put it on yourself to show that you were in mourning, to show you that you were in grief for what was happening to you. So he says he sold himself in sackcloth, this mourning, this cheap, thin cloth. And then my glory is defiled in the dust. Now glory, of course, has to do with esteem or honor. And yet his esteem is sitting in the dust. He's humiliated. He's brought low. Of course, we realize that really it says he was in the ashes. He was taking the ashes and rubbing them in his sores to try to give him some kind of relief. Verse 16, my face with weeping has become inflamed, and o'er mine eyelids comes the shade of death. Well, normally when you weep, your eyes get red when you've been crying. But he says, I've been crying so much, it's not just my eyes that are red, my whole face is inflamed. I've been crying so much. And then o'er my eyelids comes the shade of death. And Bullinger says, that's not just shade, but that's the deep darkness of the grave. So he says, the grave is already passing over me and making my face dark. Verse 17, all this was not for wrong that I had done. My prayer was pure, made in sincerity. So Job insists again, God did all this to me, yet it wasn't for anything that I did. It wasn't that I did anything wrong. He insists this. He denies categorically what Eliphaz says, that this came upon him because of some wrong he had done. He says no. Now wrong here is violence. This is not because of some violence I did to someone I harmed unjustly, some violent act that I performed. No, that's not why this came upon me, he says. He says, my prayer was pure. I was sincere when I prayed to God. I wasn't hypocritical. Verse 18, O earth, do not thou cover up my blood, and let my cry for vengeance have no rest. So he calls on the earth. That's the eretz, again in Hebrew. The land, in this case meaning the ground. So he calls on the ground that like Abel. Remember Abel back in Genesis chapter 4 when Cain killed him and God said his blood called him from out of the ground. He says, let the same thing happen with my blood. Let it cry out of the ground. Don't let it rest. Let it cry out the injustice that's been done to me. Verse 19, e'en now, lo, in the heavens my witness is, and he who voucheth for me is on high. So in spite of all that has happened to him, in spite of the fact that he thinks God has grabbed him by the neck and dashed him down and then set him up as a target and had all his archers drill arrows into him, he says, even now with all this calamity God has brought on me, I still call on my witness from heaven. I still call on God to be my witness. I still call on him to vouch for me. So he says, heaven is my witness. God is my witness. I've done nothing wrong. And I know God will be an accurate witness and agree. Verse 20, my friends are they who scorn me, mock my grief. But to Eloah I pour out my tears. So he says that his friends or his neighbors, these three friends of his, are scorning him rather than having sympathy. They're making fun of his grief rather than sympathizing with him. So what does he do? He turns to Eloah to pour out his tears. Eloah is the Hebrew for the venerable God, the one who deserves to be worshipped. And he pours out his grief to him. Even though, notice, he thinks that it's God who's causing his grief, he still looks to God in his grief for help. Verse 21, that he may justify me with himself, even as the Son of Man pleads for his friend. So he longs for Eloah, the venerable God, worthy of being worshipped. He longs for him to be the one to justify him. He longs for him to decide for a strong man, Hebrew Geber, like himself, one who was strong in rightness and didn't deserve all this. He longs for him to be like a son of Adam. The Hebrew is a Ben Adam, who pleads for his friend. In many a Ben Adam, many a son of Adam will plead for a friend when his friend is in trouble. And he longs for Eloah, the venerable God, to be that for him, to plead for him. Verse 22, for yet a few more years will come and go, and I shall go the way whence none return. So he says, if I last, it'll only be for a few more years. And that's true. Job did last after this. God restored him, and yet it was only for a few more years. Job eventually ended. And then what happened? He went the way of no return. And of course, the way of no return is a euphemism for death. Those who go into death don't return from there, of course, until God's future day of resurrection. Now, Job chapter 17 continues on with Job's argument as answer to Eliphaz's second address. So we'll just continue right on to chapter 17. Verse 1, my spirit's gone. Extinguished are my days. A grave I seek, and yet I shall not find. So he says his spirit is gone. That is, again, is the Hebrew ruach, meaning the spirit. He's referring to his spirit, of course. His spirit, his very breath, his life is gone. His days, he says, are extinguished. They've gone out like a lamp extinguished. And he seeks a grave. The Hebrew there is sepulchre or tomb. And yet he doesn't find it. He says, I want to die, yet I keep on living. I seek death, yet here I am still alive. Verse 2, surely do those who mock beset me round. Mine eye doth on their provocation rest. So he says, he's surrounded by those who are mocking him. These friends of his, they're just making fun of him. And he sees all these ones provoking him on every side. They're provoking him by telling him he did something wrong when he knows he didn't. Verse 3, arrange a pledge, I pray. Be thou my bond. Who is there else will pledge himself for me? So in his desperation, he calls on God to be his pledge. Now, one who is a pledge, what does that mean? Well, it's similar to what we have in our day when you have a co-signer of a loan. Someone's taking out a loan, and the question is, can this person pay the loan back? Well, someone comes in on the loan with that person and is a co-signer. Signs the loan along with him, so that if he can't pay, this co-signer will be responsible for it. So a co-signer, in this case, one who is a pledge for another person, is one who puts himself on the line for that other person. Now he knows that there is no one who will pledge himself for him at this point. So he calls on God to be his pledge. He calls on God to be his bond. He says, no one else will make a compact with me, so I call on God to do it. Verse 4, not they, their heart from wisdom thou hast hid. Thou wilt not then let them prevail. 'Tis said. So he says, not these friends of his. Surely they're not going to take his side. Surely none of them would be a pledge for him. He says that their hearts are hidden from wisdom. Wisdom is hidden from their inner beings. All these platitudes they're spouting, he says, are foolishness. There's no wisdom in these things they're saying. So he doesn't believe that God will let them prevail, that God will let them win, since what they say is so wrong, so foolish. And then he says something that is often said, verse 5. When one for profit doth betray his friends, his very children look to him in vain. So this is apparently a common saying at the time that he repeats. And that is that one would betray his own friends for profit. Basically, can't even be trusted by his own sons. The Hebrew is ben, sons, and not children. He says someone who would betray his friends, his children couldn't trust him. So watch out, children. Don't trust your father if you betray his friends. Verse 6, but me the people's byword he hath made, whereas aforetime I was as a drum, and all did heed the warning that I gave. He says God has now made him like the people's byword. It's like people say, oh, that's so bad. That's like what happened to Job. And think of this, Job is still kind of a byword of this today, isn't it? When people have something go wrong in their lives, they say, well, this is like what happened to Job. I think they often do it far too fast. I mean, some calamity happens, a single calamity, and yet still much of their life is still there. Job had lost everything. They haven't lost everything. Just something bad has happened to them, but they'll say, I feel like Job. So he's become a byword. Now it's very interesting that he's accused his friends of betraying him. One who betrays his friends, his children can't trust him. And yet then he speaks of God making him the people's byword. And I wonder, is he implying that God has betrayed him as well? He certainly doesn't come out and say that, but he almost seems to imply it. So he says, now I'm a byword, but before I was a drum. Now what does he mean before I was a drum? Well, a drum was used to give the signal, to beat out the signal. And when people would hear the sound and the signal of a drum, signaling something or warning of something, why, they would give heed, they would listen. He says, I was one that people would listen to. And yet now I'm just a byword for some contemptible person. Verse 7, therefore mine eye but doth become grim from grief, and all my limbs are to a shadow shrunk. So he says, because of all this grief, his eyes are dim. He says, I can barely see, I can barely look out of my eyes because of all the sad things that have happened to me. And then he speaks of his limbs. They've shrunk to a shadow of what they were before. He's probably lost a great deal of weight, partially due to his illness and perhaps partly due to lack of food. Maybe since he's so impoverished now, he can't afford food, or maybe even if he could afford it, he couldn't eat it. He's so upset. But anyway, you can just look at his limbs and see how he's wasted away. Verse 8, the upright will astounded be at this. The pure be stirred by treatment so unjust. So he says any upright person, unlike these friends of his, unlike Eliphaz and the others, any upright person would be astounded at what had happened to Job. That a man who tried so hard to be good and serve God could come to something like this. The pure would be stirred by such injustice, he says. Anyone who was pure, unlike you, 3, anyone who was pure would be stirred by the unjust treatment that's happened to me. Verse 9, but still the righteous on his way will hold. The innocent will go from strength to strength. So here Job answers Eliphaz's claims. That Job, by your arguments, by your saying that you haven't done anything to deserve it, and yet God has brought this on you. Why, Job, you're just causing people to end their devotion to God. If anybody thought devoting myself to God wouldn't necessarily lead to good in my life, it might lead to ruin like Job, why then no one would serve God. No one would be devoted to him. Remember, Eliphaz's argument was Satan's argument. That's exactly what Satan had said to God. Job doesn't serve you for nothing. He just serves you for what he can get out of it. But Job insists, no, that's not true. He says the righteous will hold on his way in spite of what happened to Job. The righteous isn't going to turn from his righteousness just if he thinks he's not going to benefit from it, that God isn't going to keep anything from bad happening to him. That isn't the only reason the righteous person is righteous. And an innocent person will be strong in his way in spite of what happened to Job. What happened to Job wouldn't turn the innocent from his strength to do what's right. Maybe it would turn people like these three friends of his, but it wouldn't turn the righteous and the innocent. Verse 10, despite them all, come now, I beg of you. Shall I not find among you one wise man? So he begs his accusers to reconsider, to rethink their arguments. He says, isn't there one wise man among you three who can see the truth? Who can think about it and realize I'm right here? Verse 11, my days are past, and all my purposes are broken off, my heart's most cherished plans. So he bemoans the fact, he says, my days are past, his life is over, as we would put it. My life is over. My purposes, my heart's most cherished plans, they're all broken off. So he says, I had purposes. I thought I'll accomplish this and then this, and I planned out what I could do, and yet all those things are useless. What good do all those plans do now in this horrible state I've been brought to? Verse 12, night is appointed me instead of day. My light is drawing near to darkness deep. He says, I've been appointed to night, not to day. Basically means I'm drawing close to death and darkness. My light is drawing near to darkness. I used to think that I had the light of many more years in front of me, but now the darkness of death is drawing near. Verse 13, if I should hope, lo, Sheol is my home. Yea, in the darkness I should make my bed. He says it's useless to start hoping. If I'd start hoping, like you tell me, if you just turn to what's right, Job, everything will be all right. He says, if I start hoping, it's useless. Sheol is my home. Now, Sheol is a Hebrew name for a state, not a place. People try to make it hell, but a state. And it's basically the state of death. We don't have a word in English for that. We can talk about poverty as the state of being poor. Wealth is the state of being rich. But we don't have a word for the state of being dead. We don't have deaditude. But Sheol was their Hebrew word for deaditude, for the state of being dead. But especially with resurrection in view, death, that's not destruction. Death is a temporary state that resurrection can end. So he says, Sheol is my home. So what point is there in hoping? My bed is in darkness. It's in the darkness of death. So why should I hope, like you say I should, in doing the right thing, and then everything will be a-okay? Verse 14, my father, thou, I say now to the grave. My mother and my sister to the worm. So he says, now my only father is the grave. Now my only female companionship, my mother or my sister, is the worm. Notice he doesn't speak of his wife. Remember, she told him to give up and curse God and die. But his mother and his sister, he says, are just worms. That's the only female companionship I have. Verse 15, if I should hope, I said, where then is hope? And who, alas, should see my blessedness? So he says, you say I should still have hope. If I do what's right, everything will come out right in the end. Well, he says, where is this hope you mention? Where is it? Where am I to look to see this hope? What hope can I possibly have when God has done all this to me, even though I didn't do anything wrong? What hope can I have then? And who's going to see this blessed condition you suggest I could come to if I just turn to what's right? Who can see this when I have been doing what's right and this happened to me? Verse 16, with me to Sheol would they both go down and rest together with me in the dust. So he says hope and blessedness, any good thing you could say about my life, both are going to go down with me into Sheol, into the state of death. That's where I'm headed. And any hope and blessedness is headed there with me. And they're going to rest together with me in the dust. And so he says, this hope you speak of is empty. It says, doomed to die as I am. So we can see that Job is in utter despair, and can we really blame him, the situation he's in? So in this portion, Job strongly denies Eliphaz's harsh accusations. Yet he sees no hope for himself nevertheless. He says God has put him in this position, strung him up to have arrows pumped into him. He's brought vile men like these friends to mock at him, after casting him down from his happy state. Yet in spite of thinking that God did all this to him, he calls on God to be his witness to the fact that he's innocent. And yet then he wonders, what good could that do me when it's God who's brought all this on me? He says his friends have betrayed him, so he calls on God to take up his cause. Yet God made him a byword to the people, of someone who comes to ruin. This would shock and stir an upright person, unlike his friends. He denies what Eliphaz claimed, that his case will cause the righteous or innocent to leave their right path. Yet he sees no hope for himself. He denies that any outcome can be hoped for in his case, but his death. So we can see here Job is hopeless and depressed. Yet do his friends ease up on him? Not at all, as we'll see next time in Bildad's second address. If you have enjoyed this video, please click like below. And until we meet again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.